In December 1997, Mafikeng was buzzing with excitement. Thousands of ANC delegates had gathered for the party's 50th national conference, a symbolic handover from Nelson Mandela's generation to a new era of leadership. South Africa, just 3 years into its democracy, was still full of hope. The world looked on with admiration, convinced this young nation was headed for greatness. But then everything came crashing down. What was meant to be a celebration of progress became the turning point in a much darker story. That day, the ANC made a decision that would shape South Africa's future, for the worse. This is the story of how one political party destroyed South Africa. In April 1994, the world witnessed a moment that once seemed impossible. South Africans of all races stood together in long lines under the sun, voting in the country's first true democracy. This wasn't just about electing a government. It was about shedding centuries of division. The world called it a miracle. Archbishop Desmond Tutu called it the Rainbow Nation. And at the center of it all was Nelson Mandela, a man who emerged from 27 years in prison, not seeking revenge, but offering forgiveness. There was real hope in the air. For the first time, it felt like South Africa could become a country for everyone. But beneath the joy of that moment lay a harsh reality. The African National Congress didn't inherit a blank canvas. They took over a country with deep contradictions. South Africa in 1994 was the most advanced economy on the continent. It had highways that matched those in the developed world, a powerful mining sector, and a sophisticated financial system anchored by the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Eskom, the state power utility, was known for producing some of the cheapest, most reliable electricity in the world. The public service, though tainted by its past, was staffed by people who knew how to keep the country running. But all this was built to serve only a small minority. Beyond the wealthy suburbs lay sprawling townships where millions lived in poverty without proper housing, water, or electricity. The education system had been designed to limit black children's futures. Health services were segregated, land was still overwhelmingly owned by the white minority, and economic opportunities for most South Africans barely existed. This was the fractured country Mandela and the ANC were tasked with rebuilding, an elegant structure in parts, but one built on a morally rotten foundation. Mandela's genius was in choosing unity over vengeance. He set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to confront the past, not to punish, but to heal. He aimed to take what functioned in the old system and extend it to those it had excluded, to create a country where dignity and opportunity weren't reserved for the few. For a moment, it felt like it might just work. But early on, South Africa stood at a crossroads. The global stage had already shown what was possible. Singapore had transformed from a struggling island with no resources into a world power by prioritizing competence and clean governance. When it became independent in 1965, it was a small, poor island with no natural resources. It was a divided society with ethnic tensions. Its leader, Lee Kuan Yew, faced a situation that looked hopeless. But he chose a path of radical pragmatism. His guiding principle was not ideology. It was simple. What works? He focused relentlessly on building a stable, secure, and corruption-free environment to attract foreign investment. Lee Kuan Yew's most important policy was his obsession with meritocracy. He believed that to succeed, the government had to have the very best people. The person best qualified for the job got the job, period. Political loyalty meant nothing. Competence meant everything. He paid his civil servants and ministers salaries that were competitive with the top private companies. His logic was clear. If you pay them well, they will not be tempted by corruption, and you will attract the smartest minds to public service. He demanded excellence, and in return, he built the most efficient and least corrupt government in the world. The result was Singapore's transformation from a poor port city into a global financial and technological powerhouse in a single generation. Then there was Botswana. At independence, it was one of the poorest countries on earth. It was a huge, landlocked nation with very little infrastructure, but its first president, Cyril Kama, was a leader of immense integrity and wisdom. He made a different set of choices from many other African leaders of his time. He committed his nation to democracy, the rule of law, and prudent financial management. Soon after independence, Botswana discovered massive diamond deposits. In so many other countries, such a discovery becomes a resource curse, fueling corruption and conflict as a small elite gets rich. Seretse ensured this would not happen in Botswana. He negotiated wisely with mining companies and declared that the diamond wealth belonged to the nation. That money was then carefully invested in building schools, hospitals, and roads for all Botswana. Critically, he built a professional, apolitical civil service. He understood that for the country to be stable, the institutions of government had to serve the people, not the ruling party. This foundation of good governance and wise investment turned Botswana into one of Africa's most stable and prosperous democracies. These two stories, Singapore and Botswana, provided a clear roadmap. The lessons were simple, but powerful. Prioritize competence and skill over political loyalty. Build a professional, merit-based civil service. Manage state resources wisely for the benefit of all citizens, and maintain a zero-tolerance policy for corruption from the very beginning. With these successful blueprints available, the question for South Africa was clear. Which path would the ANC choose? Would it follow the model of Lee Kuan Yew and Seretse, focusing on merit, good governance, and building a capable state to uplift all its people? Or would it choose a different road, one where loyalty to the party was more important than skill, and where control of the state was the ultimate prize? The answer to this question would determine South Africa's destiny for decades to come. The era of Nelson Mandela, with its grand vision of a rainbow nation, was a unique moment in history. His leadership was a wide embrace, intended to reassure all South Africans that they had a place in the new country. But this period of reconciliation was short. As Mandela stepped back from the daily running of the country, a different philosophy began to take hold within the African National Congress. The transition to the leadership of Thabo Mbeki marked a crucial ideological shift. The focus moved away from broad nation building and narrowed onto a new, more urgent priority, securing absolute control for the party. This new thinking was formally given a name and a strategy at the ANC's 50th National Conference in the town of Mafikeng in December 1997. It was here that the party made a fateful decision, a choice that would echo through the decades and fundamentally alter the course of the nation. The policy was called cadre deployment. To understand the destruction that followed, one must first understand this term. A cadre is more than just a party member. A cadre is a loyal, disciplined operative, trained in the party's ideology and committed to advancing its goals. Deployment meant the party would strategically place these loyal cadres into every important position across the country. This was not a modest proposal. The ANC's own documents were clear. The goal was to gain control over all levers of power within society. This meant far more than just winning elections and appointing cabinet ministers. It meant placing loyalists in charge of government departments, from the most senior director general down to the managers of local offices. It meant appointing party faithful to run the powerful state-owned enterprises, like the power utility Eskom, the rail and ports company Transnet, and the national airline. The plan extended even further into the security services, the intelligence agencies, the judiciary, and even supposedly independent bodies like the public broadcaster and university councils. The vision was total. The party and the state were to become one. The ANC publicly justified this strategy as a necessary tool of transformation. The argument was that the old civil service, built by the apartheid regime, was inherently racist and would actively work to sabotage the new democratic government. To build a new South Africa, they argued, they needed people in charge who were loyal to the new government's vision. On the surface, this sounded logical, but in practice, this noble-sounding goal quickly warped into a system of political patronage. The most important qualification for a top job was no longer, are you the best person to run this power station? Or, do you have the experience to manage the city's finances? Instead, the key question became, are you a loyal member of the party? Competence, skill, and experience were now secondary to political connections. The first and most immediate consequence of this policy was a quiet, systematic purge of the country's existing expertise. The government began offering generous, voluntary severance packages, which became widely known as golden handshakes. These were large cash payouts designed to entice experienced civil servants to retire early. Thousands of them accepted. While the policy was officially colorblind, it disproportionately cleared out a generation of skilled white, Indian, and colored professionals who had decades of experience. Those roles were filled quickly, but not with equally qualified replacements. The new hires were often younger, less experienced, and selected for their loyalty rather than their skill. The most damaging consequences of this policy became devastatingly clear at the highest levels of the state. The Zondo Commission of Inquiry into State Capture would later detail how the ANC's deployment committee became a production line for compromised officials. At Eskom, the power utility, key figures like Brian Molefe and Anoj Singh were deployed into top positions. They became central architects in the capture of the company, facilitating corrupt deals that enriched the politically connected Gupta family while setting Eskom on its path to ruin. At Transnet, the vital rail and ports utility, Sia Bongagama was pushed into the CEO role by the deployment committee, despite facing serious allegations of misconduct. It was a clear case of loyalty being prioritized over good governance. Perhaps most notoriously, Dudu Mayeni was appointed chairperson of South African Airways. A close ally of President Jacob Zuma, she oversaw the airline's complete financial collapse, a disaster so profound that a court later declared her a delinquent director, unfit to lead any company. These were not isolated incidents. They were the predictable result of a system that put party loyalty first. The state had handed over its most critical assets, its power grid, its transport network, its national airline, to people who didn't fully understand them, or worse, were placed there to intentionally mismanage them for personal and political gain. South Africa didn't collapse right away. The systems were still running, thanks to the strong foundation laid before, but the slow erosion had begun, and the country's future was now tied to a dangerous equation. Political loyalty mattered more than competence. That single decision to put the party first would shape South Africa's path for decades to come. The first real cracks in South Africa's post-apartheid project didn't show up in parliament or on the streets. They showed up in its biggest companies. These state-owned enterprises, SOEs, were once the pride of the nation. Under the old government, they were reliable, efficient, and often world-class. But under ANC rule, especially after cadre deployment took hold, they became tools of patronage and, eventually, looting. What followed was the slow destruction of the very engines that powered the economy. Nowhere was this collapse more visible than at Eskom. The national power utility was once a global benchmark for affordable, stable electricity. But as skilled engineers were replaced by party loyalists, things fell apart. Maintenance was ignored. Infrastructure aged and failed. The warning signs were clear, but leadership either didn't understand them or chose to look away. The final blow came with two massive power station projects, Medupi and Kusile. They were supposed to secure the country's energy future. Instead, they turned into bottomless pits of corruption and incompetence. Costs soared. Deadlines were missed. Even when they were declared complete, the plants barely worked. South Africa went from having an energy surplus to being plunged into rolling blackouts. The government called it load shedding, a soft term for a hard truth. The lights were going out, and no one in charge knew how to turn them back on. Transnet followed the same script. As the country's main freight and logistics company, it was critical for moving everything from minerals to food across the country. But corruption crippled it. Trains were bought that didn't fit the tracks. Rail lines were stripped bare or left to rust. Resources sat in mines or rotted in silos because they couldn't be transported. The economic arteries of the country were clogging up. South African Airways, SAA, was another casualty. Once a respected airline, it became a national joke. Government bailouts kept it alive long after it stopped being viable. CEOs came and went, most of them politically appointed and with no real experience in aviation. One poor decision followed another until the airline finally collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction. The pattern was clear. Capable institutions handed over to politically connected appointees, drained of talent, stripped of purpose, and eventually hollowed out. What happened wasn't just failure, it was theft disguised as governance. A slow-motion heist that didn't just take money, but robbed South Africa of its future. The collapse of South Africa's big state-owned companies was a blow to the economy, but the real damage hit much closer to home. It was when basic services stopped working that the effects of ANC policy became truly personal. When political decisions started to affect the water in the tap, the road outside the house, and the safety of the neighborhood. Local governments, now run by political appointees with little experience, began to fall apart. The most urgent crisis was in water and sanitation. In town after town, clean water stopped flowing. Taps ran dry for days or even weeks, often without warning or explanation. Sewage systems failed entirely. In places like the Vaal Triangle, treatment plants broke down and raw sewage spilled straight into rivers. The state that was supposed to protect its people was now polluting their water and poisoning their environment. The damage wasn't hidden. It was right there in plain sight. Roads crumbled. A small crack in the asphalt, once a simple repair job, grew into a pothole and then into a crater. Cars were wrecked. Deliveries were delayed. A single damaged vehicle could shut down a small business. Even dealing with the government became an ordeal. Simple tasks like applying for a birth certificate or renewing a driver's license turned into hours of waiting, lost paperwork, and unhelpful staff. What used to be a professional civil service had become a slow, bloated machine that barely worked. For millions of South Africans, the state was no longer something that helped. It had become something they had to survive. If cadre deployment was the sickness, the presidency of Jacob Zuma from 2009 to 2018 was the fever that almost the patient. This period was not an unfortunate accident. It was the logical and catastrophic endpoint of a system that had prized loyalty over competence for more than a decade. The ANC had created a state that was so weak, so pliable, and so staffed by loyalists that it was ripe for the picking. During these years, South Africa was introduced to a new term, state capture. This meant that the state itself had been hijacked. It was no longer working for the people. It was working for the private interests of a small, politically connected elite. At the center of this was the Gupta family, a group of businessmen who had formed a deep and rewarding friendship with President Zuma. The method was brutally simple and effective. The Guptas would allegedly influence the president on who to appoint as ministers and as heads of the already weakened state-owned enterprises. These were not just any appointments. They were the final, most extreme form of cadre deployment. Loyalists were placed in power not just to serve the party, but to serve the financial interests of the president's friends. Once in position, these deployed officials would steer massive state contracts worth billions of rands to Gupta-owned companies. Eskom and Transnet, already weakened, were now systematically looted. The corruption was brazen. It was a fire sale of the nation's assets, and the very people appointed to protect those assets were the ones holding the matches. To ensure this could all happen without consequence, the final line of defense had to be dismantled: the justice system. Loyal cadres were appointed to head the National Prosecuting Authority and key positions within the police service. The result was that investigations into high-level corruption were blocked. Cases against powerful politicians and their allies were dropped. A culture of complete impunity took hold. If you were connected, the law did not apply to you. The Zuma era was the moment when the system of cadre deployment showed its true face. It was no longer a tool for transformation, if it ever was. It had been perfected into a sophisticated system for looting the state, protected by a wall of loyalists who made sure that no one would ever be held accountable. When Jacob Zuma was forced out of office in 2018, many hoped it marked the start of real change. His successor, Cyril Ramaphosa, came to power with a powerful message of change. He spoke of a new dawn for South Africa, a time for cleaning up, rebuilding, and putting an end to the rot that had set in. For a moment, it felt like the country had a second chance to make things right, but the new dawn has struggled to break through the morning mist because the fundamental problem was never just about one man. The problem was the machine itself. The deep systemic decay could not be fixed simply by changing the driver. This is because the core policy that caused the decay, the policy of cadre deployment, remains the official doctrine of the ruling ANC. President Ramaphosa found himself in an impossible position. As the president of South Africa, his duty is to build a capable, merit-based state that serves all citizens. But as the president of the ANC, his power relies on holding together a party that is built on a system of patronage. For decades, the way to get ahead in the ANC was to be a loyal cadre, rewarded with a powerful and well-paid government job. This system created powerful networks and internal factions that have a deep interest in keeping things exactly the way they are. To dismantle cadre deployment would be to dismantle the very power structure of his own party. The ultimate proof of this conflict came from the Zondo Commission, a judicial inquiry into the state capture of the Zuma years. After years of testimony, the commission's final report was clear and damning. It identified cadre deployment as a central cause of state capture, calling it unconstitutional and illegal. It was the moment of truth, a clear diagnosis of the nation's sickness from the highest legal authority. The ANC's reaction was telling. Instead of accepting the finding and vowing to abolish the policy, the party became defensive. It defended its right to deploy its members, arguing it was essential for transformation. It showed that even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of the destruction its core policy had caused, the party was unwilling or unable to let it go. And so, the ghost remains in the machine. The ANC continues to place its own loyal members in charge of critical institutions, often overlooking more qualified independent candidates. The dream of a truly professional, apolitical civil service, like the ones that drove the success of Singapore and Botswana, remains just a dream. You cannot fix a machine while leaving the ghost inside that is programmed to break it. Without removing the poisonous policy of cadre deployment, any talk of reform is just tinkering at the edges of a system designed for failure. The ANC, once the heroic movement of Nelson Mandela, has become the biggest obstacle to the very people it claimed to liberate. And that leaves South Africans with a painful question. How do you fix a nation when the party that was supposed to heal it has become the cause of its illness? The answer will shape South Africa's future. It depends on whether the people can look beyond old loyalties and fading memories and demand something better, leadership built not on party allegiance, but on competence, accountability, and a true commitment to the country itself.